Welcome to our final panel of the 10-day conference, The Meat and Dairy Industry, How the Animal Food System Imposes $414 billion yearly of externalized costs on taxpayers, animals, and the environment. And we have Melanie Warner, author of Pandora's Lunchbox, David Simon, author of Meatonomics, and Will Tuttle, author of The World Peace Diet. And throughout this conference, one of the themes has been that for health purposes, it's recommended that people eat a plant-based diet. Another theme is that the plant-based diet is very good for the environment and all the environmental issues. And a third theme has been that a plant-based diet is beneficial, very beneficial, for the treatment of animals. And those are the three themes. If you say to someone, why do you eat a vegan diet? Why do you eat a plant-based diet? Why are you vegetarian? It's environment, health, and the environment. Now, this panel is saying something even further. It's saying this actually, when you don't eat a plant-based diet, it's when someone eats a hamburger or eats a non-plant-based diet, they're actually imposing costs on you. So even if you don't care at all about food, you don't care about the environment, you don't care about health, you don't care about animals, a lot of people still don't like to pay taxes. So this is a panel to start out with saying that every time someone eats animal products, it's a tax on you that you have to pay. It costs you money. So with that being the theme, would you guys like to give your general thoughts and your thoughts on that?
Sure. If anybody saw my talk earlier today, I used this example, and I'll use it again to explain the concept. If I take my garbage to the front of my driveway and I leave it there and I pay somebody to pick it up, I internalize my garbage collection costs. On the other hand, if I take my garbage and I throw it in a park, I externalize my garbage collection costs. That is to say, I force somebody else to pay to pick up my garbage. And we typically say that it's appropriate for us to internalize our costs, and it's inappropriate for us to externalize our costs. So many commentators over the years have expressed the view that many different industries, not just the animal foods industry, but many industries, oil and gas production, energy production, the tobacco industry, externalize their costs. So this is not a new phenomenon, nor is it new to say this about animal foods. And many people have proposed different numbers for the animal food industry. So I've got a book that proposes some numbers, and other people have different views. So certainly different people on this panel might even have different views as to how the animal food industry externalizes costs. But I don't think that there is any debate that it does. One of the points that I make in my book is that this industry externalizes more of its costs than any other industry in this country. More than oil and gas production, more than energy and electricity production, more than the tobacco industry. This is the country's single leading industry when it comes to externalizing costs and imposing those costs on the rest of us. I calculate the figure at $414 billion, which is about half of what we spend on Social Security in this country each year, or it's about 1/4 of Canada's gross domestic product. So it's a very large number.
Thanks, David. I wonder how you can put a cost on a lot of the costs, but in the research I did on for the World Peace Diet, it was really shocking to see how many different subsidies go to the meat, dairy, and egg industries in many different forms. There's various numbers that are thrown around that a hamburger should cost $35 or who knows what if the industries really had to pay the going rate. For example, grazing allotments where they can graze their cattle on BLM land for just pennies per head, just virtually for free. and where we pay for governmental agencies like the BLM and the USDA, Department of Wildlife Services, and other agencies with taxpayer funds to kill millions of animals and to destroy basically our public lands in order to profit private interest, in order to profit large-scale ranchers and farmers. And there's huge, irrigation systems that have been put in place at taxpayer expense that basically deliver water virtually free, which would again cost them millions of dollars if they had to pay for it. And there's price supports, there's public school lunches where, all the excess production of the dairy industry, or a lot of it, just gets dumped into public schools and into other countries, and they're forced to eat the stuff, and we, the taxpayer, pick up the tab on a lot of that. So there's a never-ending array of those kinds of things. But I think beyond that, really, in many ways, I think it was kind of in your question, Steve, that the health costs, the fact that when people eat meat, dairy products, and eggs, they're going to be much sicker, and that's going to also, we all have to pay for that. The United States is kind of, I think, world famous, not just world famous, I think we're probably famous throughout most of the galaxies in the universe for having an incredibly expensive healthcare system that does not deliver a lot of healthcare, actually. I mean, it delivers a lot of expense and pharmaceutical drugs and procedures of various kinds, but it's very expensive and we don't have a lot of health to show for that. And there's many reasons for that, but I think underlying this whole thing is that there are large financial institutions that are making huge profits, and that we, the people, and animals, and future generations, and ecosystems are really paying dearly. And I don't see how you can put a price really on any of this. I mean, how can you put a price on someone who's undergoing chemotherapy, who has cancer from eating meat that has residues, lots of toxic pesticides that end up in dairy products, and so forth. The suffering that people endure, the suffering that animals endure, the devastation of ecosystems, it's hard to quantify that. And I've seen actually studies. I remember when I was getting my Ph.D. at Berkeley, and I took some courses in quantitative and qualitative research analysis, and it's very interesting to see how some studies have tried to put a value on a human life. And one of the ways that they did that was they basically cooked a human body, determined that there was like $2.95 worth of minerals, so that's what it's worth. That's how you quantify a human life, $2.95. I mean, how do we quantify, how do we put a dollar figure on any of these? How do we put a dollar figure on being able to swim in clean water versus the fact that we can't do that anymore, or be able to breathe, live our lives breathing air that's enjoyable to breathe. The loss of the quality of life, I think, is enormous. And as I've said, I haven't been to a doctor in 40 years, or to a drugstore or anything else. And so this whole gigantic establishment is not making money off. I mean, I think in general, when we live our lives, we have to just question, we have to live our lives so that we're not allowing them to externalize costs as much as we can through our choices, and then really try to do education and pass laws. Because if people had to pay really what these foods would actually cost, then we would see a huge decrease in the amount of meat and dairy products and eggs that are actually being sold, because it would just, show how much it really should be. We should be paying. So these are public policy questions that I think we can all lobby on and do the research, and we have to have alternative ways of discussing these things like we have here, because the mass media, has been really bought and paid for by these same corporations, and so we don't hear this. We just don't have a chance to hear these kinds of things. But luckily, we have people like Steve and all you folks that are essentially doing what we can to, in a grassroots way, bring some kind of sanity to the situation. But it has very deep roots. It goes back, in my research on the World Peace Diet, basically it goes back 10,000 years when we first started owning animals as property for food, and this wealthy elite began controlling, and it was the ranchers from the very beginning. You go back to the Old Testament kings, or the ancient Greek plays, the kings, they controlled the military and the religion and the government, and they still today. It's gone right through, and it's the same people, the same exact thing. They make the laws. They don't want to. They make the laws in their favor, and they have the money and the power. But we have spirit and truth and love, and that, I think, in the end will for sure win.
Yeah, I think this is a great conversation to be having, looking at these externalized costs, because it's something that we don't hear very much about. And for me as a journalist, I look at this issue as a failure in storytelling. Most people don't live anywhere near farms. I mean, we might live near small farms, people who go to farmers markets. We might have even been to some of these farms, but we don't live anywhere near the agricultural heartland where meat production happens. So in Iowa, in areas of North Carolina, Texas, some areas of California, we don't live anywhere near that, so we don't see what happens. We don't live downwind of it to smell the awful smells. We don't live near a stream that's had waste and ammonia runoff feed into it. We've never smelled a hog lagoon. So I think that if there was some way that we could open that up and start to tell more stories, and I mean, people in this audience are probably aware of a lot of the realities of meat production, but most people in this country aren't. And even when I have conversations with my friends, I try and tell them a little bit about factory-raised meat versus more sustainable meat and just different practices. And you throw around numbers and you throw around terms and you talk about it a little bit, but it's really hard to convey it if you haven't seen it, if you haven't been in the slaughterhouses and seen how fast these carcasses come flying through, and the people working there and these awful jobs that they have. If you haven't watched some of the undercover videos, because that's the only way you can get inside the actual barns where the animals are raised. So I think if we could do a better job of telling those stories and getting those stories out there, we need to create the visibility so people understand what really happens on farms with meat production, what those costs are, and how it affects us all, and find ways of giving people that lens into what's really happening.